Hello. So in this video I'm going to cover some of the basics of doing PHP programming as it relates to our courses around information security. The end goal isn't so much creating a website, but it's to create the foundations of understanding how you build security in your design of components in a website. Before we can do that, however, we need to understand some of the basics of PHP programming, and that's what we're going to cover in this video today, hopefully. So first things we're going to talk about is setting up your stack. Now you've already got an instance of Linux running here. In our example here, and again I'm using PuTTY just so you can have better visuals on what I'm typing in. But in our example here, we have Linux already running, specifically an instance of Debian 11 to be specific. For us to do PHP, we don't need anything else other than to install PHP. But when we're doing our PHP, it's in a context of web development. So we're going to have to set up a full web server stack. And that includes adding components such as Apache and MySQL to our PHP code. So let's take a look at that. First things we're going to do is become root. We are connected. I am connected to IP address 21. I've set up a static IP on this. There are lecture notes on that in Learn. But if I'm going to add or change anything with regards to server processes, I need to be root. So the first thing I'm going to do is to become root. I use the dash to reload my session variables. It allows me to find the sysadmin-like executables more easily. Now I am in as root. I can now add the components I need to my instance. First thing I'm going to install is Apache 2. That is the web server that we are going to use for our environment. So the sequence of software that I am adding looks something like this. I just set this machine up, so I'm not doing update or upgrade, but normally you would. I literally just set up this VM, so I didn't do the update or upgrade because it is quite literally less than an hour old. But the first thing we are going to install after that is Apache 2. Okay, so we have Apache 2 installed. Now, as I was mentioning, apologize for the white screen, as I was mentioning in a previous lecture, anytime you install something in the context of information security, you want to validate it. Everything in information security should be validated, verified, and you should know what you've done has worked properly. We're going to do the same thing here. Before we get into testing network functionality or anything else, we're going to make sure our Apache deployed properly. We're going to do that by installing a command line browser called Lynx. It's the next thing we're going to install. And what Lynx will give us is the ability to browse from the command line. Specifically, we type in Lynx localhost, and it shows us a basic web page. Perfect. Q to quit. As always, first thing we try is Q to quit. In this case, it happens to work. Now that I know Debian is working, now that I know Apache is working on Debian, I need to test the network functionality as well. We do this by bringing up our browser and navigating to the IP address that we set up. And when I do, again, the IP address of my Debian on my host-only network, we are using host-only networks in this class, the IP address of my Debian loads the default Apache web page. This tells me that my Apache 2 is working. It also tells me that my network is configured as well. I can continue with adding the components necessary. The next thing I'm going to add is PHP and the Mariah database server. So we're going to go ahead and install those. Now we could batch install all of these things and it would probably work. You can do something like apt install Apache 2 links, PHP, Mariah database server, separating them and issuing it all in one command. However, in the past I have seen things break by trying to do too much with one apt install command. So, erring on the side of caution, and because we are being cautious, we are information security, we're going to do them one at a time. PHP should deploy fairly quickly. And now we can deploy our database server. This will take a little longer, but it is a little bit more software, so it's not unreasonable. If you happen to hear wine glass clinking in the background, it is wine time. At this point, we have most everything we need in place. We are missing, unfortunately, one component. Now, if we change the order of how we deployed this software, it might not be a factor. But again, we're being cautious. We're actually being very methodical as well in our approach. The one piece that's missing is the driver between PHP and the Mariah database server, which, as we've said many times in our class, is basically just an update to the MySQL. Once Oracle purchased MySQL, the project forked. The open source version that is now included in Debian is the Mariah database server, but we are going to install a driver between PHP and Mariah. The last thing we are going to install, is the PHP MySQL I database driver bridge between PHP and the Mariah database, even though it says MySQL. It won't prompt us because it's just one thing that is going to set up and deploy. So everything has been installed. We should be pretty good at this point. I'm not going to get into the remote database administration. That'll be covered in a different lecture. But if we want to manage our Mariah database remotely, we are going to need to change the configuration. And I'll cover that in a different video. At this point, however, I've done a lot of stuff, so I need to restart my Apache. Alright, I'm also going to restart my Mariah and my MySQL services as well. Just restarting everything because I've installed a bunch of new components. These were probably unnecessary at this point, but again, we are information security. We are very purposeful in what we do. So let's go over here, reload, and no different. Perfect, that's what we expect. What has been different in our environment, we now have a directory called www in our var directory. This is a directory that was created so that we could populate websites, okay? One of the directories in this is a directory called HTML, and that's what we call the document root. That's where our website content goes by default. You can get into the configuration of Apache and change the document root to something else, and you can deploy applications that they have completely different document roots while maintaining this one as the default application. Again, out of scope for what we're talking about here, but Apache does allow a fair degree of customization. I mean, it should. It's one of the longest running projects with regards to web servers, and it just happens to be open source, but it's been running for a very long time, so of course it has all kinds of flexibility in its configuration files. Regardless, I have this set up now, but if I want to be able to upload from a remote connection, I need to change some of the permissions. So I'm just going to quickly cover this because if I want to deploy website content, I really do need to give myself the ability to do that. So let's do that. The first thing I need to do is I need to recognize what the permissions are. Root owns it. Root's group, the group root, doesn't have permissions. The only person who can change anything in this directory is somebody who goes in as root. So when I log in as SJ, I have no permissions to that folder. So I need to go in as root, and start changing the permissions. And this is a couple of different steps. We've covered this in lecture notes in Learn as well, but I'm going to do it all in one place. So the first thing I need to do is I need to change the group ownership of this. Now you can do it with the change group command, but I'm going to do change own. I want root to own it, but I want a different group to own it. And that group is www-data in our instance. So the group www-data is the group ownership of this directory. They still don't have permissions to make any changes to that directory. So we're going to have to do something about that. All right, we're going to go change mod 775 to our HTML again. That means the owner root has full permissions, right? The owner root will have full permissions. But what's more important is anybody who's in the group www-data will have full permissions to that folder as well. And when we do that, without any typos, of course, now if I can figure out a way of adding SJ to that group, I'll have full permissions to that directory. Perfect. Let's see what that looks like. So, as I was saying, I'm going to add the user SJ to the group www-data, and I realize that I've done this a couple of different ways with students. I'm going to use the user mod command. I'm going to say user mod, and I'm going to add to the group www-data, and to the group www-data, I'm going to add the user SJ. All right, and it looks like I got it backwards. No, I don't have it backwards. I forgot the -G. www-data, and that is the user SG. I forgot the dash. I could have done -AG as well. That looks better. Perfect. Typos will get you every time. So, now when I take a look at the group file, in the group file there is a group called www-data, and the user SJ is part of it. Long story short, now when I launch WinSCP, okay, and I'm just going to bring this over here so we can see it. When I launch WinSCP and I try and go to the IP address, logging in as SJ, I will save that just so I can. That's fine. I need to capture the key. Not only am I able to log in because I have it set up properly, but if I go down to var www HTML, I can create a new directory. I'm going to call this directory PHP_tests. It doesn't really matter. But the fact that I can create it shows that I have the correct permissions in place so that I can create content in my website in the correct folder. Now that we have everything in place, let's take a look at PHP programming. I'm going to reference our lecture notes that I have in our Learn shell. We're going to talk about PHP. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the history or the importance of it. It has a long history. We're up to version 7. It is one of the more popular web development languages out there. It is being supplanted by JavaScript. Full disclosure, JavaScript is becoming much more popular. However, the important lesson isn't the syntax, but the style of programming, web programming in general, and the security considerations. So frankly, the language is less important than what we're doing and why we're doing it. Syntax is syntax. Once you understand how to program, you can learn another syntax fairly easily. Once you understand control structures, variables, and, more importantly, security considerations around things like login and other vulnerabilities that we see with websites, syntax is just syntax. It's been around for a long time, like I said. It's very popular, and it looks fairly straightforward. Now, I can create this very easily in a text editor and upload it and stuff like that, and then test it through the browser. But I'm going to test it through the command line first. So let's take a look at this. Here's my code. I have it available right here. And rather than try and type, I'm sorry, you can't see, I have it off camera. Rather than try and type this in, I'm just going to highlight and copy the code, because frankly, you don't need a test on typing at this point in your lives. You need a test in comprehension. So let's take a look at that. I could, at this point, go over to my WinSCP. I could go into my PHP tests directory, and I can go create a new file and create this. But I'm going to do this over here in my terminal. I'm going to go into my HTML. I'm going to go into my PHP tests directory. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, tab is your friend. And I am going to use vi. I'm going to call this hello world.php. Okay? I'm going to go insert mode, and because I'm using putty, I can use my alternative, for me, my right mouse button, and paste the code that I just copied. Escape to go back to command mode, :WQ, looks good, and I can say php hello world.php, and it will run my script. Awesome. Now, why didn't I run that through the browser? Because I want you to understand the main difference between PHP code and HTML code. When I take a look at the exact same thing in a browser, again, I'm going to go / what's my directory? PHP tests. And then I click on the Hello World PHP. It doesn't look the same here as it does here. One of the important things to keep in mind about the difference, I apologize for the siren in the background, one of the joys of living downtown. One of the difference between PHP and HTML is that PHP isn't by itself a web tool. It is a scripting language that is used inside of a HTML document. If I view the source, that's what I expect it to see. However, because there is no HTML structure around my code, it looks like that. Now, if I want to make it look better, well, this is where I can actually get into this. If I refresh this folder, I can actually edit this document in my preferred text editor, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to spend a lot of time in this text editor today. Okay? Rather than saying "Wello world," let's say "Hello world" for starters. And second of all, if I start adding HTML around my PHP code, saving that, refreshing, you know what, I'd like to say I did this on purpose, but I did not. What happened was I created this file as root. And because I created this file as root, I cannot modify it as SJ. So I cannot modify this file until I change the ownership. Let's get out of that. There. It's now owned and grouped owned by SJ. Perfect. If I refresh this, the group ownership changes. Perfect. And now we'll try opening it like this. Okay, I'm going to close this because there's a chance it's held on to the properties. So let's try this again. Hello world. Start paragraph tag. And then before the carriage return, the /n, by the way, is a carriage return. Strictly speaking, not necessary, but it makes reviewing the source code a little bit easier. Save that. Now it's uploaded. Perfect. And now when I reload, we see something a little bit better. And just so you know, these line breaks are a result of the /n. It's a new line. It's a carriage break. It's a carriage return line break way, so that you're not only, and it doesn't matter to the browser. The browser doesn't care. What the browser cares about are the HTML tags. But if you have to debug your own code, putting some line breaks in your PHP makes it that much easier to read. Just for your information. Okay, so I've got my code in place. Things look a lot better. Perfect. Okay, and here we go here. You can keep the following key points in mind going forward. Unlike the Python programming you've done in the past, PHP uses semicolons and curly braces to delineate new lines and code blocks. When we take a look at our example here, there's a start curly brace, there's an end curly brace, and then there's a semicolon at the end of each line. Okay? If you want to add comments, you can do something like this. All right, and then star end again, and you can see, I mean, it's difficult to tell here, but I have syntactical highlighting in my browser that shows commented code as green. As soon as I properly end my comment, it actually cleans it up quite a bit. Okay, you can use that for multiple lines, or for a single line of comment you can use the // either is acceptable. All right, two ways of doing comments: // or /* star to start, /* to start a comment block, and then */ to end a comment block if you want to do multiple lines. Okay, however, these are stored inside of files that the Apache browser has access to. And if you are going to do that, you need to do a couple of things. You have to identify your code as having .php. This tells Apache to look inside for PHP code. It's expecting HTML documents. If you call it .php, it's going to look inside for that PHP code. Also, it's going to look for anything inside of this structure here, the start and end PHP code block. All right, you can have HTML structure outside of that. All right, I can say HTML, boom. I can give myself a header and a title, and I can say this is my first PHP example. End my title, end my head, start my body. All right, give myself a level 1 heading, end my level 1 heading. And this is all perfectly acceptable. HTML programming techniques. All right, this is all completely fine. I don't need that. That was just silly. And I do need that. Okay, much better. Okay, this is all completely fine HTML code. And the Apache server is just going to pass that on to the browser without parsing it or anything else. It doesn't care about that. What it cares about is anything inside of the PHP tags. That is what it's going to take and run that through the PHP rendering engine. And then it's going to pass that code along as HTML to the best of its ability. And then it'll go back to reading the rest of this document just as regular HTML and then pass it along. So once we save that and reload our document, again, we have all the stuff we did and then our PHP code sitting inside of it, as we see right there. Native HTML, the result of our PHP programming. It's that simple. Next thing I want to talk about are variables. First things first, we're already working with variables in our example. When we take a look at our sample code, the string I is an indication of a variable. I didn't define it ahead of time. I didn't say it was an integer. I didn't do anything. I just used it. And that's part of the beauty of variables in PHP. They're very loosely typed. You don't need to define them. You don't need to declare them. You can just start using them. And mostly the variable data types can be changed on the fly. The one exception is going to be a constant. You really can't redefine a constant once you've defined it. And unlike what we saw in Python, there's no indicator of the data type. There's no special character differentiating the variable types one from the other. They all basically start with the $sign. Constants, you don't actually have. You define them ahead of time, and you usually use them. You don't assign a constant, you define a constant. Similar to what we do with the immutable variables in Python. You actually define it. You don't go ahead and modify it in the future. In a future class, we will see that, and I apologize for the sentence structure, but we will see an example of this in our classes when we start playing around with database connections. That's a really good place for a constant. And it looks something like this, okay? Now we can add this code to our PHP fairly easily, okay? And then see what happens when we run it. So I'm going to go back over here to my source code again, move it over here so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to go down to the slide on constants, and I'm just going to highlight the text, copy it all. I'm going to go back to my text editor, and somewhere inside of my block. Now normally you define constants at the beginning of your code, so you know what, let's do that. Let's go up here where I'm at the beginning, and I'm just going to add some text to my PHP block. This is PHP code. All of this is PHP code, which means it needs to sit in front of the start, or it needs to sit inside of the start to end PHP code block. Okay, I can save that, and I can reload my page. Now, the problem is when there's an error, and we've talked about this in class, but this is a good place to revisit it. If there is an error, PHP is not going to say anything. Back in the day it did, and that was a problem. Because, you see, hackers would actually do things to introduce errors into the web application by messing around with the data entry that we would see in forms. Or by messing around with link information. If there is a link to specific content inside of a website, using the get method, of course, hackers would mess around with the text on that link just to see what happens, just to mess with it. And if it would throw errors, they would glean some intel about how your website worked. Since version maybe 6, but definitely in version 7, by default this is turned off. So if you want to enable this, you have to make it work. And that's what I'm talking about in these slides here. Okay? We can modify our code. Now I don't think it's 7.3, I think it's 7.4 we're using today. But you can modify the configuration that PHP uses. You can go around line 480 and you can change a variable from display errors to on. It will look something like this. Let's do that together. I'm going to go back to PuTTY. All right. I am logged in as SJ. All right. So I really need to become root again. I am root. So now I'm going to nano etc network, it's etc PHP up 7.4 as I said, and it's under Apache 2 and php.ini. That's the file we want to mark. Now I can do control and shift and underscore, and it'll ask me to go to a line number. And the line number I want to go to around numlock 4. Okay, I'm going to have to use the keyboard and not the number pad. Okay, I want to go to line 480. And we can see it right here. Display errors is off. I can change that to on. Now normally you see me comment at my code. I would comment out this line, replicate it, and in the comments I would say modification made by SJ on this date for this reason. But this is a throwaway server, so I'm just going to make a quick change. Control O, write the file out, and Control X. And because I've changed my PHP configuration, I need to restart Apache. Again as root. Okay, so now when I go back to my browser and reload, it tells me what's wrong. Okay, there's something wrong. Line 11. Oh, what's going on with line 11? And the line 11 problem is I'm trying to redefine the wrong answer. It is a constant. It will not let me define that. Fine, I'll comment that line out, save that, and try again. Okay, it will say the wrong answer is already defined. It won't fail. It's a warning. It'll say you've already defined that constant. You shouldn't be doing that, but it won't throw an error. So we'll comment that line out as well. And now when I reload, things are much better off. It's not complaining about any errors or warnings. So constants are used to ensure that you don't try and change the value, like the immutables were in Python. Okay, perfect. And I don't really need any of that, but I'm going to leave that. You can do operations with our constants. However, you can't reassign them, and you certainly can't redefine them, or you can't you can't apply an operation without redefining them, and you shouldn't redefine them. Okay, perfect. So that's what we're talking about here. Other variable types are available. This is not a complete limit, but it's a pretty good indication of the options that are available to us. Other than result sets from databases, we don't spend a lot of time with arrays, but we do play with integers and strings quite a bit. Floats, these can all be switched fairly easily. You don't have to define them ahead of time. We can take a look at some of these, but because PHP was built for web development, first and foremost, it was built for web development. And because it was often viewed as more of an introduction way to get into web development, it just ended up growing into the default. But it started off as an introduction. There are a lot of functions that are available to you for string manipulation. Far more than we can cover in this course, let alone in this quick little video I'm trying to do. Just be advised that the link that I reference here in the presentation talks about the string functions that are available to you, functions and methods that are available to you in PHP. And of course, you can create your own functions as well. All right? When it comes to strings, one thing I do want to mention, however, is that strings can be delineated by either single quotes or double quotes. If you use a single quote, you don't have to worry about embedding variables in it, it won't work. But if you use double quotes, you can actually embed variables inside of them. We'll see some samples of that in a future class as well. Also note, the double quotes kind of do some processing. So when we were taking our look at our code here, I did hello world \n, okay? Let's try that and see what happens. All right, perfect. Should never veer off of my lecture notes, but I was pretty comfortable in this one. Because the string I is embedded inside of double quotes, PHP knows to look inside for some kind of a processing it needs to do. So it processes the \n and it processes the variable right there. If I had this inside of single quotes, like this, which is acceptable, it wouldn't really make any sense to it. All right? Also, the reason why this appears outside of the paragraph marks is because I close my paragraph and then I echo this, so it throws it out. Remember, browsers will try to the best of their ability to render whatever it sees in the document, or in this case being rendered by PHP. It does a paragraph, the start paragraph, the end paragraph, and then it has an extra thing, and it doesn't know what to do with it, so it just dumps it there. And then it does another paragraph, and another paragraph. Also, it doesn't understand that string I is a variable, because again, the single quotes. We change those to double quotes, and we get more of what we're looking for. Not going to cover arrays here. There are a lot of array functions available to you, but most of what we're going to do with arrays is going to be less than what you saw with the arrays in Python. The only thing that we really see arrays on is when we start manipulating form data, and we'll talk about that when we do database accessing with our PHP programming in the future. Again, they're fairly loosely typed. The only big difference between arrays is that you can't just print an array. If you want to dump out the entire contents of an array, you have to use the printr function. It makes debugging your arrays a lot easier. So when it comes up, remember, dumping the contents of the entire array is best done with the printr function rather than trying to print or echo an array. Operators. Operators are used for either comparison or assignment. And this is one area where students struggle more than anything else. When it comes to the equal symbol, one equal is to assign a value to a variable, for example, or assign the value of one variable to another. We see that in our code here. I is equal to 0. That is assigning the value 0 to the variable I. Okay? That is not a comparison. A comparison is done with two equals. If something equals something, that is when you use two equals. Or if you want to compare the data types as well, three equals. We rarely see this, but if you want to compare values and data types, you would use the three equals. A single equal is for assigning a value. 2 or 3 is for comparison, or the greater than, or the less than, the greater than, the less than or equal to, the greater than or equal to, the not equal to. These are all fairly standard for comparison as well. Okay? We have and or operators, double ampersand, double pipe for and or respectively. Okay? Control structures. Well, again, we've already seen an example of a control structure, but the for, the while, the case, all of these are examples of control structures. We already have an example of a for structure here. We can also do a while structures as well. We can say while some condition, string j is less than 10, again, it's a programming block, so we need a curly brace. I want to do something, and I'm going to echo out, this is the j loop, and j is string j, again, inside of double quotes, so I can echo out the value of my variable. I'm going to end my p, in my paragraph, \n, so my code is a little bit easier to read, closing my semicolons, and ending my PHP statement with a semicolon, ending my curly brace. Now, if I were to run this as is, first off I'm going to set j to a value, alright? To say string j is equal to 0. Assignment, okay? If I were to run this, I am going to create an infinite loop. Not necessarily something you would see in the browser. I'm going to create this infinite loop. It's going to cause problems, but that's okay. It doesn't look like anything is happening. And the reason is because I have this infinite loop. Now, how do you manage that? If you have an infinite loop, you restart your Apache. Okay? That should solve it. And as you can see, my page is no longer trying to load. Restarting Apache solved the problem. All right? And I'm actually going to stay in as root in case I need to do that again. If, however, I create an infinite loop like this, all right, because I never increment my variable. And this is what you do, this is what happens when you create an infinite loop or a runaway process. From the command line, you can do Control-C and that will stop it. If, however, you do it in the browser, the easiest way to get around this is to restart your Apache service. All right, I'll move this down so you can see. All right, but if I go restart Apache, it should stop the process. There it is. Okay. It actually looks like it may have restarted itself anyway, but that's okay. So, how do I fix this? Well, I need to do something here. I need to increment my j, string j ++. And this is the same thing we've seen in so many other environments. We can say increment the variable, just like we're doing right here. Now, when I reload my document, it's much better. Okay, I can nest one variable inside of another variable. I can say if string j is equal to, all right, this is where we do the difference between assignment and comparison. If string j is equal to 5, what I want to do is something else. Yeah, we can do that there. I'm going to say echo j is now 5, or whatever. I'm not the most creative person in the world. \n, closing quotes, semicolon, and of course I need to end my curly brace. All right. Start, end, start, end. Save that, and I have nested. And because I did the assignment, everything works fine. Now, if, well, no, I'm not going to talk about that. Okay, so let's go back to our lecture notes and see where we are. We talked about control structures. We can do a for condition. We can do a while condition, which we've seen. We can do an if condition. We can also do an else if as well. And we can also do the switch, case 1, case 2, and a default overall condition. Very similar again to what we saw with Python. Finally, you can actually write your own functions as well. And when we get into database and sanitizing inputs from our forms to mitigate against SQL injections, we will see that we can write our own functions as well. So this will come up in a future class as well. But as I say right here, there we go. As I say right here, it is very handy for writing functions to sanitize your form data before you hit the database. Also, in a couple of weeks when we take a look at mitigating against SQL injections, you're also going to want to sanitize data coming out of your database as well. So we'll revisit this in great detail at that time. Okay? Functions are often written to return either a value or a result set. When we take a look at the Stung-Eye blog software and querying our database, we're going to see that we're going to write functions to return data from the database, and it'll return an entire set or specifically an array of data. Okay? And finally, as we've seen in our example here, PHP will sit inside of an HTML document. And as I explained at the beginning of the lecture, Apache expects, unless you've configured a server-side includes, which is way outside of scope for this presentation, but it is something we talked about when we were doing our first examples of pen testing using the Hack This Site. We use server-side includes, and I mentioned at the time that server-side includes were embedded inside of an HTML document, and that's how you got dynamic content way back in the day. PHP kind of attached to that and extended it quite a bit, but they kept that core design consideration where if you set up PHP in Apache, which is what we did, we installed Apache, we added PHP to it, and then that told Apache, hey, look for PHP code. Apache expects us to identify PHP code by calling our documents.php and embedding the PHP tag and the endPHP tag inside of an over HTML document structure. And that's what I'm trying to say here. PHP typically exists inside of an HTML document. Somewhere inside of the DOM, it will exist as PHP code. Now, not exclusively, there are frameworks that we see in the PHP world that will take the presentation, the database access, and the business logic as three completely separate entities. And, you can work with them individually. You can create a framework, Cake PHP. If you want to do a little bit more research, Cake PHP is a good example of this. But there are frameworks out there that will allow you to create just the presentation stuff, just the database access stuff, and just the business logic, the core PHP code. But by and large, when we're looking at it, we are going to see something like this. An HTML document with PHP code nested inside of it. Okay? Also, it is not uncommon to see HTML inside of the PHP. Whoops, wow. Did that ever not work the way I wanted to? We will see HTML inside of the PHP block inside of an HTML document. All fine, completely fine. Which is best? It really does depend on what you're trying to do. I don't want to step out of the PHP code just so I can drop a paragraph tag. That doesn't make sense. I could stop and I could just say echo out a PHP and then I could start all my PHP code again, but that doesn't make sense to me. It's much easier just to drop a little bit of PHP code here or HTML code here and a little bit of HTML code there inside of my PHP code. And that's what I'm trying to say with this last example here. It makes sense for us to embed our HTML inside of our PHP when necessary. However, it is required that we embed our PHP inside of the HTML document structure or the DOM. If you have any questions on any of this, let me know. Otherwise, I hope this helps to clarify what we're trying to do with PHP in our web server security course. Good luck, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.